Hi everybody, this is THP with a review of RPG Maker MV for Nintendo Switch. TLDR, it's good, but very slow and clunky. It's just as entertaining as always, but the Switch version honestly feels like it's going to break every 5 seconds I use it. But it never really does, so when you get over that, it becomes just as addicting and fun as any version of RPG Maker before it. Not my favorite iteration, mind you, but it's perfectly serviceable to anyone that needs to put their game ideas on a screen. I would wait for a few updates to fix all the bugs first though, but other than that, I mean, you could definitely do a lot worse. It's fine and fun enough to keep you invested. And now, the full review. With this new Nintendo Switch and PS4 version of RPG Maker MV, it will mark the 3rd time I review this software. I started with the original RPG Maker MV on PC a long time ago, and then the 3DS version RPG Maker FES. Finally, we have the Nintendo Switch version of MV that I played, which is probably my least favorite version out of all of them. This does not mean that the game is bad by any means, but it does have some technical issues that sort of stop it from being my default choice for bringing my RPG ideas to life. Honestly, I still prefer the 3DS version for quick and spontaneous ideas that I want to jot down, and then developing them further on the PC version. However, if the Nintendo Switch version ever gets any updates that fixes all of the annoying issues, then I would have less problems recommending it. So if you have no idea what RPG Maker even is, the answer is in the title of the game itself. This is a game/software that lets you create your own simple 2D RPG in the vein of classic Super Nintendo games like Final Fantasy and many others. Granted, the PC version of RPG Maker MV is far more advanced, lets you import original assets and download plugins, but that doesn't stop the console versions from being fun experiences all on their own. I doubt you'll be able to make your own version of Yume Nikki on any console version of RPG Maker, but as I said, you can still find the fun in it. MV, just like all other versions, comes with a ton of pre-made assets you can play around with, and even create your own characters with a very limited character creator, but a creator nonetheless. From big set pieces to tiny details, RPG Maker MV has you covered on most fronts, especially this version that gives a few pointers before you begin. When you boot the game up for the first time, you are greeted with a comprehensive tutorial on the bare basics of creating your own RPG, like creating dialogue, making doors that lead to different maps, and making NPCs move. I like this a lot since it gives you a good place to start without feeling completely lost in the many menus and buttons that you will have to familiarize yourself with every time you want to do something new. The only thing I don't like about this tutorial is that it doesn't do enough in my opinion. It doesn't offer anything more advanced other than the elementary knowledge required to start. There's no sections like, oh, beginner, medium, advanced, or anything like that. It's just a few minutes of them explaining some very basic things, and that's kind of it. The other 95% of MV is left for you to figure out for yourself, which is great for really creative people, but terrible for the easily overwhelmed. Not only that, but I couldn't find a way to see the tutorial again after it was done, so if you forgot what the tutorial taught you and you want to be reminded of something, well then you're out of luck. One thing that I would have also appreciated was if the game offered some sort of short sample world that we could see in action, just to see what was possible with the tools available to you. But instead, you are left with an empty canvas with your name on it. It's not a deal breaker, but I think most people would appreciate a good example of what can be done with RPG Maker MV, instead of going in almost completely blind. In any case, after the tutorial is done, it's off to the races as you construct everything about your RPG, and I really do mean everything. Every location, character, text, music, enemy, everything is completely up to you to decide. You can even give some characters voice acting with some pre-made sound bites, which is something that I don't remember ever happening in older versions. That was definitely fun to mess around with, so I appreciate it. The details can even go as far as changing the terminology for all of the basic elements of an RPG. If you want to change the word magic to farts, then go ahead, the world is your oyster. You could also take the easy route by not bothering with any of that and leaving everything with its default name. You get out of this game as much as you want to put in. The actual process of creating your RPG is quite easy, especially for the Switch version that has 2 ways of doing it. For one, you can use a controller or the Joy-Cons for playing on TV mode, which is comfortable in its own right. There are many shortcuts and commands that make moving the cursor around the screen relatively easy. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but when it clicks, you'll be flying through all the menus like a natural. Obviously, nothing will be faster than the mouse and keyboard, but the control scheme is good enough, I think, to have the creative process not be too much of a struggle. However, I found myself getting far more into it in handheld mode, where I could use the touchscreen for every single feature, including typing out all of the text far more easily than having to do it with a controller. Touchscreen controls are a godsend when you can undo mistakes at the tap of a button, or easily zoom in and out of the map without having to find your cursor and trudge your way over to the appropriate buttons. The only problem with touch controls is that the interface doesn't scale to make this comfortable. Most of the time you'll find yourself trying to tap on tiny buttons and hope that you didn't hit something else by mistake. And speaking of tiny things, a ton of assets, images, and text in handheld mode look so microscopically small that you will be digging your face into the screen constantly to get a clear view of all of the tile sets and the character sprites. When you're on TV mode and see it on a big screen, yeah, it makes it better, but most things will still look pretty small there too. Many moments I had to actually get up from where I was sitting and look at the TV very closely so that I could see what kind of characters and tile sets I was actually selecting. But despite all the fun I had, I unfortunately have more issues beyond just that. I mean, I appreciate being able to make my own game. I mean, I took a long time making my own little town with characters, and all of the pre-made assets look really cool. I like the monsters and making battles and all that stuff, but there's just something that is ever present that sort of gets in the way of that. So as I alluded to before, my issues with this game is less about the creation process itself. Actually making your own RPG is not the problem here. It's more about the technical hiccups that plague the entirety of the Switch version. Every single step and button press you make feels unstable, like a computer chugging and struggling not to crash. Selecting menus and tools for your creations always takes an uncomfortably long amount of time to respond. I was constantly wondering if the next button press will be the one that will crash the game completely, making me start from my last save again, but that moment never came. It's a stressful and constant ghost that is always looming over you when you play this. But the worst part hasn't even arrived yet. We still have to playtest our game, oh boy. If you spend a long time creating your RPG and then move on to playtesting, it's a nightmare. When the moment of truth comes and you finally start testing the game you worked so hard on, it's difficult to enjoy it with how broken the game player is. Sometimes the controls simply won't respond to your button presses at all. I felt like I had to slam my fingers into the buttons hard multiple times for it to register just one press of the A button. You'd think that just pressing something with the A button would be like the most pivotal, most essential thing that you would need to have work, but sometimes it just doesn't work. This also happens during battles where I tried to select options from menus and nothing would happen. Eventually the game would catch up to all of my button presses and just leave me confused as to where I actually am because it catches up with everything that I pressed. Sometimes only one button press will register as 2 or even 3 presses all at once. The perfect example is when you start a battle and you want to look at your magic spells on a menu. You might be fooled into thinking that the magic menu doesn't show up at all and it goes immediately into targeting an enemy, but that's not the case. It's actually the game registering one button press as multiple presses, which makes the game go so fast as it tries to catch up with itself that it skips over the magic menu entirely, creating this clunky mess of trying to back out a press of the B button that flat out doesn't want to work either, and properly select the menu that you want. The most baffling part of these issues is that they practically don't exist if you save and quit the project entirely, and then play the game you've made so far separately through another menu option on the home menu. I don't know what it is. I guess the game just sort of gets overloaded, having to load up all of the assets and loading up all of the things within your project if you make a really big world, and so then when you try to playtest it, it just takes too long to load because I have no idea. All I know is that when I playtest within my project, it's a glitchy, broken mess where none of my movements or button presses work half the time. But when I leave and I just play the game separately, it works just fine. So it's just a strange thing. But even then, even if you are playing the game separately, there are still issues, like the game freezing up for a second when you enter and leave the main menu. It is nowhere near as fast or as snappy as you would want it to. And also, my characters love moving in a straight line without me actually pressing anything. And let's not forget a lot of audio clips that get cut off towards the end. I know that the PC version of MV has this issue as well, where all of the audio clips are like delayed. But yeah, here they get caught off in really awkward times as well, so it's difficult to listen to all of the clips and sounds fully. This is only a few of the many small tiny issues that start to build up over time, which makes this version of MV on Nintendo Switch look very unpolished and honestly really messy. I know that this North American release of RPG Maker MV got delayed for a good long time and is just now coming out in 2020, so it really makes me wonder, how did the game run before? I can't imagine how bad this game would work at the start if this is the mess that we are made to play right now at launch. I'll be honest, I had a ton of fun creating my small game that I named Wall Breakers, which had a fully realized town with houses, NPCs, and events. I even added an overworld map with a randomly generated dungeon and other locations that you could explore. I created all of that out of practically nothing, which makes me proud and further encourages me to work on it even more. However, all of the prevailing issues that I mentioned definitely knocked the whole thing down a peg. In conclusion, playing RPG Maker is like playing Minecraft. If you are a creative individual that wants to craft their own stories and doesn't need to be told what to do, then this will be a great outlet for you to express yourself. However, if you are the kind of player that would rather have a linear set of goals to follow with a straightforward path, then you'll be overwhelmed at the empty canvas and large selection of tools in front of you. The bugs and the lack of polish won't help in getting you into it either. Now, I can't speak to the quality of the PS4 version. My assumption is that that version runs a little better, but that's not the version that I reviewed. I got the Switch version, and so that's the one that I can speak to. Overall, if you can get over some clunkiness and some flat-out broken things on the game's part, this is still a pretty competent version of RPG Maker MV that you can carry around everywhere on your Switch. Despite its flaws, I spent more late nights than I want to admit on my Switch with my eyes glued to the screen. It was exciting every time I learned something new about what I could do in MV while creating my own little world for the sake of this review. But I kind of fell in love with my own little world and my own little characters that I made. I had so much fun doing it that I will most definitely continue building out my project until I'm happy with it and maybe upload it to the internet so that other people can play it, far after this review is done. If you don't want to spend the $80 it costs to get RPG Maker MV on PC, you could do a lot worse than grabbing it on Switch, especially if you just want to make games casually or play other people's creations online. As I said, I'd still rather play the 3DS version. That one is still a bit more comfortable for me to play. And if you really want to get into serious game development, then yeah, definitely go for the PC version and maybe go for other software that's not RPG Maker. But yeah, this game is definitely aimed at people that sort of just want to do this for fun and not take it too seriously. If that's you, then hey, pick it up. And as for me, a person who wants to create his own video game someday, this was a fun little exercise in learning how to design stuff like this. So if RPG Maker MV is not your end-all be-all for game creation, at the very least you can consider it a journal or a notebook where you can take small notes about all the cool ideas that you have in your head that you can make a reality someday. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time. And keep your eyes peeled for my next video review, which will be Moedo Crystal H on Nintendo Switch.